There is a plant growing in the cracks of sidewalks across North America right now, pushing through the gravel of abandoned parking lots, climbing out of the disturbed soil at the edges of construction sites. Chances are, you have walked past it 1,000 times. You may have yanked it from your garden and thrown it in the trash. It grows practically everywhere, and almost nobody gives it a second look. It is called lamb's quarters. At least, that's one of its names. Depending on where you are in the world, people call it goosefoot, fat hen, white goosefoot, wild spinach, pigweed, or simply a weed. In India, where millions of people still eat it every winter, it goes by Bathua. Its scientific name is Chenopodium album, and it belongs to the same family as one of the trendiest, most expensive health foods on the planet, quinoa. That connection alone would make it interesting. But lamb's quarters is more than just quinoa's forgotten cousin. Its seeds pack roughly 16% protein by dry weight. Its leaves contain more calcium, more vitamin A, and more vitamin C per gram than commercial spinach. A half cup of dried seeds delivers nearly 20 grams of protein and over 1,000 milligrams of calcium. For context, a similar serving of cooked chicken breast gives you around 26 grams of protein but almost no calcium, no vitamin A, and no vitamin C. Gram for gram, when you factor in the full nutritional picture, this free roadside weed competes with some of the most expensive protein sources in the grocery store. And the plant has been feeding human beings for longer than wheat, longer than rice, longer than almost any crop you can name. At least, that's what everyone assumed for a long time. Then scientists started cutting open ancient stomachs and sifting through the remains of prehistoric kitchens, and the story got much, much older. Nobody was paying attention to Chenopodium album for most of modern history. Farmers sprayed it. Gardeners pulled it. Agricultural textbooks listed it as a common broadleaf weed, a nuisance to be eliminated. If you mentioned it at a dinner party, the most you'd get is a confused look. That was about to change. The first real clue that this plant mattered, far more than anyone realized, came from a peat bog in central Denmark. On May 6, 1950, two brothers cutting peat near the village of Bjaldskovdal pulled something from the dark earth that stopped them cold. A human face, perfectly preserved, staring up from the wet ground as if the person had fallen asleep there yesterday. The peat had kept him almost intact for more than 2,000 years. They called him Tollund man. His body was curled in a fetal position, a braided leather noose still wrapped around his neck. Archaeologists determined he had been ritually killed, likely as a sacrifice, sometime between 405 and 380 BCE, deep in the Scandinavian Iron Age. His skin was tanned dark by the acids in the bog. His eyelids were closed. His lips were pressed together in an expression so calm that the men who found him initially thought they had stumbled upon a recent murder victim and called the police. Tollund man became one of the most famous archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. The preservation was extraordinary. The stubble on his chin was still visible. The wrinkles around his eyes were intact. But what really captured the attention of researchers was not how Tollund man died, or even how perfectly the bog had preserved him. It was what he had eaten. When scientists examined the contents of his stomach and intestines, they found roughly 250 grams of partially digested food, a dense porridge made from barley, emmer wheat, flax seeds, and the seeds of several wild plants. Among them, prominently, were the seeds of Chenopodium album, lamb's quarters. The weed growing in your backyard was one of the last things a man ate before being ritually strangled and laid in a bog 2 millennia ago. In 2021, a team of researchers re-examined Tollund man's gut contents using modern techniques, including lipid profiling, protein analysis, and advanced palynology. They confirmed the original findings and added new details, traces of fish protein, the presence of flax seeds, and evidence that the meal was a thick porridge, not unlike oatmeal, cooked over an open flame. The lamb's quarters seeds were not a minor ingredient. They were a meaningful part of the recipe. And Tollund man was not the only one. A second bog body, Graubar man, found just a few years later in the same region, had a remarkably similar stomach. Barley, various grains, and once again, the tiny black seeds of lamb's quarters. Whether these seeds were gathered deliberately as food or arrived as part of threshing waste from grain processing became a subject of intense academic debate. But a separate discovery in Denmark settled the question in dramatic fashion. At the site of Nørre Fjand, on the western coast of Jutland, archaeologists unearthed a deposit of lamb's quarters seeds dating to the first few centuries of the Common Era. The deposit measured over 1,600 cubic centimeters. When researchers estimated the total count, they arrived at roughly 2.4 million individual seeds. That is not an accident. That is not crop contamination. That is a deliberate, massive food storage operation. Someone, or more likely an entire community, was systematically gathering and stockpiling these tiny seeds as a staple food source. The Danish archaeobotanist Hans Hellbeck, who spent decades studying prehistoric plant remains, wrote about this find in the 1950s. He called it clear evidence of the separate gathering or cultivation of these seeds for food. The question of whether lamb's quarters was a domesticated crop or simply a heavily foraged wild resource in Iron Age Scandinavia remains open. But the sheer scale of the evidence makes one thing undeniable. This plant was not some marginal survival food. It was central to people's diets. And the European evidence goes back much further than the Iron Age. Archaeobotanical studies across the continent have identified Chenopodium album seeds in contexts stretching back to the Neolithic period, roughly 7,000 years before the Common Era. In early Britain, seeds were found preserved in earthen pots from some of the oldest known settlements. At the Bronikai site in Poland, which spans from Neolithic through Bronze Age occupation, Goosefoot seeds appeared consistently in archaeological features alongside cultivated grains like emmer wheat and einkorn. The Swiss Lake Village settlements, some of the best preserved prehistoric communities in Europe, also yielded evidence of Chenopodium use, suggesting the practice was widespread across the continent. In China, the plant was documented as a food source by approximately the 5th century of the Common Era. Hunter-gatherers and early farmers across Europe and Asia were eating this plant for thousands of years before anyone thought to write it down. I mean, think about that for a second. We're talking about a food source that predates the pyramids, predates Stonehenge, predates the invention of the wheel. And today, most people in the Western world would walk right past it without a second glance. Now, the European story is extraordinary on its own. But the real plot twist happens when you cross the Atlantic Ocean. In eastern North America, long before European colonizers arrived, indigenous peoples had built their own independent agricultural system. Archaeologists call it the Eastern Agricultural Complex, and it represents one of the most significant and least understood chapters in the history of farming, starting roughly 5,000 years ago and intensifying around 3,500 years before the present. Native American communities in the river valleys of what is now the Midwestern and Southeastern United States began deliberately cultivating a handful of native plants. Among them were maygrass, little barley, sumpweed, knotweed, and a close relative of lamb's quarters called Chenopodium berlandieri, pitseed goosefoot. This was not casual gathering. This was agriculture. Archaeological evidence shows that foraging for wild chenopod seeds in eastern North America goes back to at least 6,500 BCE. By around 3,000 years ago, something shifted. Researchers started finding seeds at archaeological sites with seed coats dramatically thinner than those of wild plants, less than 20 microns thick compared to the 40 to 60 microns you'd see in a wild specimen. That kind of change only happens through generations of selective breeding. Someone was choosing the seeds that were easiest to process, planting them, harvesting them, and repeating the cycle year after year. And here's the remarkable part. When Native Americans stopped cultivating these plants, the seed coats reverted to wild thickness within just a few growing seasons. The thin coat was not a permanent genetic change. It was maintained only through continuous human selection. Stop farming it, and within a few years, the plant forgot it had ever been domesticated. The Hopewell culture, the Mississippian mound builders, communities that constructed some of the most impressive earthworks on the continent, relied on goosefoot as a major food source. It was cultivated alongside 3 other starchy seed crops, maygrass, little barley, and knotweed, forming a complete nutritional foundation that sustained large populations for centuries. This decision seemed small at the time. It wasn't. When archaeologists at the Riverton site in Illinois examined storage pits associated with ancient houses, they found enormous quantities of chenopod seeds that had been selectively bred for easier processing. The wild food enthusiast Ewell Gibbons, writing in the 1960s, gathered and ate these same plants and confirmed what indigenous peoples had known for millennia. They were delicious and filling. And if that were the only discovery, it might have been a footnote. But then genetic studies in the early 2000s revealed something remarkable. For years, some researchers had suggested that the cultivated chenopod found in eastern North America might have been introduced from Mexico, where a related subspecies was already being grown. Ancient DNA extraction settled the debate. The eastern North American domesticated variety was locally derived. The genetic distance between the eastern plants and the Mexican cultivated forms was substantial. Native Americans in the eastern woodlands had independently domesticated their own species of chenopod, separate from and parallel to the domestication of quinoa in South America. 2 different groups of people, thousands of miles apart, on 2 different continents, looked at members of the same plant family and independently decided these were worth cultivating. That kind of convergence does not happen by accident. It happens because the plant is genuinely, objectively useful. The real question is what happened to this crop, because by the time European explorers arrived in the 1500s, pitseed goosefoot had largely disappeared from indigenous gardens. The answer, in short, is maize. Corn first appeared in the eastern woodlands around 1600 BCE, but for nearly 3,000 years, it was a minor crop, just one small part of a diverse garden system. Goosefoot and the other native seed plants remained dominant. Then, around 1150 of the Common Era, something shifted. Maize became a major dietary staple across the region, and the old crops got pushed aside. The reasons were probably practical. Maize produces higher caloric yields per acre and stores well, but the transition came at a cost. The diverse, locally adapted crop system that indigenous farmers had spent millennia developing was replaced by a single import. Within a few hundred years of European contact, the domesticated form of pitseed goosefoot appears to have gone functionally extinct. Centuries of selective breeding, thousands of years of cultivation, a uniquely North American agricultural tradition, all of it vanished. Modern experimental cultivation trials have shown that a polyculture of goosefoot and knotweed actually outperforms global averages for closely related domesticated crops and produces yields comparable to traditionally grown maize. What was lost was not an inferior system. It was simply a different one, which, looking back, was either a natural transition or an enormous loss, probably both. Now, while the Western world was busy forgetting about chenopodium, one major civilization never stopped eating it. In India, lamb's quarters is called Bathua, and it has been part of the food culture for so long that nobody thinks of it as exotic or unusual. It is just food. Ancient Ayurvedic texts reference a plant called Vastuka that scholars widely identify as Chenopodium album. The Charaka Samhita, one of the foundational texts of Ayurvedic medicine dating back to at least the 1st century BCE, describes a plant matching its characteristics and praises it for its warming, digestive properties. Ayurvedic practitioners classified it as useful for pacifying certain doshas and for supporting liver function. But Bathua's role in India goes far beyond medicine. Walk through any vegetable market in Rajasthan, Uttar Pradesh, or Punjab during the winter months, and you will find bundles of fresh Bathua greens stacked alongside spinach and fenugreek, sold for next to nothing. Street vendors pile it high on their carts. Grandmothers haggle over the freshest bunches. Cooks use the leaves to stuff parathas, a popular flatbread that gets served with butter and yogurt for breakfast. They stir it into saag, the slow-cooked greens dish that most Westerners only know in its spinach-based form. They add it to dal, toss it into curries, and blend it into soups. In some households, Bathua paratha is as routine as toast and eggs are in the West. Nobody thinks of it as a superfood. Nobody markets it with fancy packaging. It is just dinner. The reason is partly tradition and partly nutrition. Bathua is extraordinarily cheap and abundant during the cool season, and Indian cooks have always understood what Western nutritionists are only now rediscovering. This plant is packed with good things. The leaves deliver high concentrations of beta-carotene, calcium, potassium, iron, and vitamin C. The seeds, smaller than quinoa but nutritionally similar, contain around 13% protein with an excellent amino acid balance, including high levels of lysine and methionine, two amino acids that are typically hard to find in plant-based foods. That amino acid profile is a big deal. It means the protein in lamb's quarters, seeds, is not just abundant, it is high quality. It contains the building blocks that the human body cannot produce on its own, in proportions that make it remarkably easy to digest and use. For a plant that grows wild on roadsides and demands absolutely nothing from the farmer, that is an almost absurd level of nutritional generosity. There's a reason this story is still talked about today by foragers and food historians around the world. Lamb's quarters managed to be one of the most important food plants in human history, while simultaneously being treated as garbage by the same civilizations it once sustained. The plant's fall from grace in Europe happened gradually, driven by the same forces that reshaped the entire continent's food system. As agriculture became more industrialized from the 17th century onward, governments and landowners pushed for larger yields of staple grains, wheat, barley, rye, and eventually potatoes. Wild and semi-cultivated plants like lamb's quarters got squeezed out. They didn't disappear from the landscape. The plant is far too resilient for that. It kept growing, stubbornly, abundantly, everywhere, but it disappeared from the menu. It was reclassified in the cultural imagination, once a food, now a weed. Once a crop, now a contaminant. The English common name, fat hen, tells part of this story. By the time the name became popular, the plant was primarily associated with poultry feed. Farmers noticed that chickens eating lamb's quarters put on weight quickly, hence the name. The implication was clear. This was animal food, not people food. Never mind that the same plant had been sustaining human populations across Europe for thousands of years. Social stigma is a powerful thing, and once a food gets tagged as something poor people eat or something you feed to livestock, it becomes very difficult to rehabilitate. The great Russian novelist Leo Tolstoy, writing about crop failures in his country, referenced the closely related plant oroki, noting that during famines, everyone, the well-to-do and the poor families alike, ate bread made from it. The Purdue University Famine Foods database records Chenopodium album as a documented famine food across India, China, and Russia, with the leaves boiled with salt and chili peppers or the seeds ground into flour for bread. There is something deeply uncomfortable about a plant that saved millions of lives during the worst moments in history, being dismissed as a weed during the good times. If you're wondering how that's even possible, so is everyone else who has looked closely at the data. The numbers are staggering when you lay them out. Raw lamb's quarters greens deliver 96% of the daily recommended value of vitamin C per 100 grams, 73% of the daily value for vitamin A, 37% for riboflavin, 31% for calcium. The seeds, when dried and measured, hit roughly 16% protein and contain significant iron at 64 milligrams per half cup, along with over 1,000 milligrams of calcium in the same serving. Compare that to commercial spinach, and lamb's quarters wins in nearly every category. More calcium, more beta-carotene, more potassium, more iron, more protein. And here is the part that makes the whole story almost absurd. This plant is a direct relative of quinoa. They are both members of the Chenopodium genus, the Goosefoot family, named because the leaves are shaped like the webbed foot of a goose. Quinoa, Chenopodium quinoa was domesticated in the Andes roughly 5,000 years ago and has become one of the most commercially valuable grain crops on Earth. It sells for a premium at health food stores worldwide. It has its own section in the grocery aisle. People pay $5, $6, $7 a pound for it. Lamb's quarters, its wild cousin with a nearly identical nutritional profile and a similarly impressive amino acid balance, grows for free in the cracks of your driveway. Nobody planted it, nobody watered it, nobody weeded around it. It just showed up. And each plant can produce up to 50,000 seeds in a single growing season. Those seeds remain viable in the soil for decades, waiting patiently for the right conditions to germinate. It thrives in disturbed soil, requires no irrigation, no fertilizer, no pesticide. It grows from sea level to altitudes of over 3,400 meters in the Himalayas. It tolerates drought, poor soil, intense sunlight, and sub-freezing temperatures. It is, by almost any measure, one of the most resilient and productive food plants on the planet. That's the kind of comparison that makes nutritionists lose sleep. Nomadic peoples across Persia and Central Asia understood this instinctively. They carried lamb's quarters seeds in their food stores as a reliable famine reserve, a green that could grow practically anywhere and provide crucial nutrition when everything else failed. Rural European folk traditions valued it as a spring tonic, cooking it alongside nettles in those hungry weeks before the first real harvest of the year. In Japan, people preserved the leaves with salt for later use. The Zuni people of the American Southwest cooked the young greens as a vegetable dish. Across continents, across cultures, across millennia, this one plant kept showing up at the table. The Lewis and Clark expedition, crossing the American West in the early 1800s, noted lamb's quarters as a plant that settlers widely assumed had been introduced by Europeans. They were wrong. Archaeological evidence would later prove that North American indigenous populations were using it long before any European ship arrived. So where does that leave us? We live in an era obsessed with superfoods, with ancient grains, with the idea that somewhere in the past, people ate better than we do now. Billions of dollars flow into the quinoa industry. Chia seeds get sprinkled on everything. Acai bowls cost $14 at juice bars. And meanwhile, one of the most nutrient-dense, historically significant, and universally available food plants in human history grows uninvited in gardens, fields, roadsides, and vacant lots across the entire temperate world, and almost nobody in the West eats it. The modern foraging movement has started to change this, slowly. Books, blogs, and social media accounts dedicated to wild edibles have introduced a new generation to lamb's quarters. Foragers prize it for its mild flavor, which many describe as similar to spinach but earthier, with a slightly mineral taste and a pleasant, pillowy texture when steamed. The young leaves can be eaten raw in salads. The mature leaves are better cooked, which also reduces the oxalic acid content. The flower buds are edible and taste something like broccoli. The seeds can be ground into dark flour or cooked into porridge, exactly the way people were eating them in Scandinavia 2,000 years ago. You can even sprout the seeds during winter months as a fresh green supplement. The plant itself is easy to identify once you know what to look for. The leaves are shaped like a goose's foot, roughly diamond-shaped with wavy, toothed edges. The undersides are coated in a whitish, waxy powder that makes water bead up on the surface in an almost iridescent shimmer. Young leaves sometimes have a purple or fuchsia tinge. The plant can grow anywhere from a few inches tall to well over 6 feet in rich organic soil. It is, according to wild food researchers, the second most nutritious wild food plant in North America. Only amaranth, another ancient grain that modern health food stores now sell at premium prices, ranks higher. There is one caution worth mentioning. Like spinach, rhubarb, and beets, lamb's quarters contains oxalic acid, which in large quantities can contribute to kidney stone formation. Cooking reduces the oxalate content significantly, and most people can eat the plant without any issue. But those with existing kidney conditions should be mindful. The plant can also absorb nitrates from contaminated soil, so foraging from industrial sites, roadsides with heavy traffic, or chemically treated lawns is a bad idea. But those practical notes aside, the core story here is one of collective amnesia. We are a species that ate this plant for at least 9,000 years. We domesticated it independently on 2 different continents. We stored millions of its seeds in underground granaries carved into the Scandinavian earth. We cooked it into the last meals of ritual sacrifices in Danish peat bogs. We stuffed it into flatbreads during famines and into Ayurvedic prescriptions during times of plenty. We bred it for easier processing and selected it for larger seeds. We traded it along rivers and carried it across mountain passes and packed it into the food stores of migrating caravans crossing Central Asia. And then, over a few hundred years, the Western world simply forgot. Not because the plant failed us, not because something better came along and made it obsolete. We forgot because the economic systems that replaced subsistence farming had no room for a crop that grew itself, fed people for free, and could not be easily controlled, packaged, or sold at a profit. The real question is not whether lamb's quarters is nutritious. The science on that is settled. And the real question is not whether people should start eating it again. Millions of people in India already do, every single winter, the same way their ancestors did 1,000 years ago. The real question is, what else we have forgotten? How many other plants, once central to human survival, are now growing unnoticed at the edges of our parking lots and highway medians, dismissed as weeds by a civilization that has lost the ability to recognize its own oldest foods? The Eastern Agricultural Complex alone contained at least 5 domesticated crops that have effectively gone extinct as cultivated species. Lamb's quarters is just the one with the best survival story, because it refused to stop growing even after we stopped paying attention to it. If you found this one interesting, you should check out this video next. It digs into another piece of history that most people never hear about.